poor rancher let a pregnant widow stay for one night, unaware she was a millionaire. Snow whips across the high plains as a lone rider appears at his gate. Her clothes are worn, her voice steady, and she asks for nothing but a place to rest. Before riding on, he figures she's got nothing but the child she carries. Until the wind dies and a rider from town brings a paper with her name on it, naming her the owner of a silver fortune. Now the night he offered in kindness could cost him his land, his freedom, and her unborn child. Powerful men circle like wolves, eager to strip her of everything. She's got secrets she won't speak, enemies she won't name, and a past she can't outrun, a ranch on the brink, a widow with more to lose than gold, and one storm that could change both their lives forever. This channel isn't just about stories. It's about holding on to what still matters. Empathy, truth, love, and the courage to care. The bitter wind whistled through the fence posts, making them creak like old bones as Gideon Halley drove the last nail home. His weathered hands, chapped from the cold, tested the mended post with a firm shake. It would hold, at least until spring brought better working weather. The setting sun painted long shadows across the snow-dusted pasture, and his breath clouded in the fading light. The sound came soft at first hoofbeats, muffled by the gathering dusk. Gideon straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his back. These days, caution came as natural as breathing. Through the dim light, he made out a single rider approaching. The horse moved slow, clearly tired, its head hanging low. The rider was wrapped in a threadbare cloak that whipped in the wind, revealing the unmistakable shape of a woman, heavy with child. She drew her mare to a stop a respectful distance away. "Evening, sir," she called out, her voice carrying a gentle strength despite her obvious fatigue. "I'm Clara Morgan. I hate to impose, but I'm seeking shelter for the night. Just until morning, I'll be on my way west with first light." Gideon's jaw tightened. The last stranger he'd trusted had nearly cost him everything. But as he studied her, the first wet flakes of snow began to spiral down from the darkening sky. The woman Clara shivered visibly, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. "Storm's coming," he said gruffly, more to himself than to her. The weather would turn dangerous soon enough. Even his ingrained wariness couldn't justify turning away a pregnant woman in such conditions. "There's room in the barn. The house will do better," he amended, seeing her condition clearly now. "Follow me." He led her horse to the stable first, helping her dismount with awkward courtesy. Clara moved stiffly, but insisted on helping to unsaddle her mare despite his protests. Her hands were sure in practice. She knew horses well enough. Warmth of the house hit them like a wall as they stepped inside. The lamp on the kitchen table cast a pool of yellow light, and the iron stove radiated blessed heat. Clara unwrapped her cloak, revealing simple but clean traveling clothes beneath. "I'm much obliged," she said softly. "I don't need any special treatment, just a corner to sleep in will suffice." A creak from above drew both their attention. Sam perched on the ladder leading to the loft, his young face alight with curiosity. The boy had always been too friendly for his own good, too quick to welcome strangers. Gideon would have to have another talk with him about that. "That's Sam," Gideon said shortly. "My nephew, Sam. Finish your reading and get ready for bed." "Yes, Uncle Gideon," Sam replied, but his eyes stayed fixed on their visitor. "Are you having a baby, ma'am?" "Sam," Gideon's tone held a warning. Clara smiled gently at the boy. "I am indeed, young man. In a few months' time." Gideon busied himself at the stove, spooning up beans from the pot he'd left warming and slicing thick pieces of yesterday's bread. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was hot and filling. He poured coffee into tin cups, noting how Clara's hands trembled slightly as she accepted hers. "Thank you," she murmured, settling carefully onto the bench at his gesture. She ate slowly, with the deliberate movements of someone trying to mask exhaustion. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the window panes. The snow was falling heavily. Now thick white curtains visible in the lamplight. Gideon's conscience, already uneasy about having a stranger under his roof, couldn't quite wrestle with the idea of sending her out in such weather. Pregnant or not, he retrieved a wool blanket from the chest clean, if a bit worn, and carried it to the parlor. The old sofa wasn't much, but it would serve for sleeping. "One night," he said firmly, meeting her eyes to be sure she understood. Clara nodded, accepting his terms without argument. "One night," she echoed. "You're very kind." Kind wasn't a word Gideon would have used. Practical, maybe. A man couldn't call himself Christian and turn out a woman in her condition to freeze. But kindness had little to do with it, he returned. To the kitchen, aware of Sam still watching from the loft ladder instead of preparing for bed as instructed. The boys' fascination with their guest was clear and dangerous. They'd learned the hard way that trust had to be earned, not freely given. Outside, the storm strengthened its grip on the land, snow piling against the windows and wind moaning through every crack and corner of the old ranch house. One night, Gideon told himself again. Come morning, she'd be on her way, and things would return to normal. But as he banked the stove for the night and checked the doors one final time, he couldn't shake the feeling that normal might not be so simple to maintain. The snow showed no signs of letting up, and something in Clara Morgan's eyes spoke of troubles that wouldn't be so easily left behind when dawn came. Morning crept over the ranch in pale fingers of light, revealing a world transformed by snow. Drifts piled waist-high against the barn, and the fence posts Gideon had mended yesterday were barely visible beneath white caps. The wind still cut sharp enough to steal a man's breath. Gideon woke to unfamiliar sounds from his kitchen. The soft clink of his mother's old china coffee pot, the scrape of a spoon against a mixing bowl. For a moment he lay still, his mind struggling to place these domestic noises in his bachelor household. Then he remembered their guest. The scent of fresh coffee and baking biscuits drew him from his bed. He found Clara Morgan already dressed and moving about his kitchen with quiet efficiency. Her hair was neatly pinned back, her sleeves rolled up as she worked the dough on his scarred table. "Good morning," she said, looking up. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to repay your kindness." Before Gideon could respond, thundering footsteps announced Sam's arrival. The boy clattered down the loft ladder, drawn by the promising smells. "Are those real biscuits?" Sam asked, eyes wide. "Like the kind Mrs. Peterson makes for church suppers?" Clara smiled, dusting flour from her hands. "I reckon they might be. Would you like to learn how to fold the dough to make them extra flaky?" Sam nodded eagerly, and Gideon watched as Clara guided his nephew's small hands through the motions. Her patience with the boy's clumsy attempts stirred something uncomfortable in Gideon's chest. It had been too long since Sam had known a woman's gentle teaching. The biscuits, when they came out of the oven, were indeed as good as Mrs. Peterson's. Gideon studied the swirling snow outside the window as they ate. "Trail's closed," he said. "Finally, storm's still got a grip on us. Wouldn't be right to send anyone out in this." Clara accepted this news with a slight nod. "Then I'll earn my keep today, if you'll allow it." True to her word, she set about putting his bachelor household to rights. Her pregnant state didn't seem to slow her much as she swept, straightened, and organized with practiced hands. By mid-morning, she had discovered a pair of Gideon's old work gloves with split seams. "These can be saved," she said, producing a small sewing kit from her pocket. Her needle flashed in the winter light as she made tiny, even stitches that would hold far better than Gideon's own crude repairs. Sam watched her work, fascinated. "Ma'am, my boots always come untied. Uncle Gideon says I'm just careless with the knots." Clara set aside the mended gloves. "Bring them here. There's a special way to lace them that helps them stay tied better." Gideon found himself pausing in his own chores to watch as she demonstrated a crisscross pattern that made Sam beam with pride. The boy immediately wanted to release his spare pair the same way. By afternoon, the wind had died down, but the snow remained deep. Gideon headed out to check on the stock, tramping a path to the barn through drifts that reached his thighs. The animals needed extra feed in this weather, and the work kept his mind from dwelling too much on the stranger under his roof. As he forked hay into the mangers, a glint of brass caught his eye. Clara's small carpet bag sat tucked behind a hay bale, partially covered by her saddle blanket. The lock securing it was fine craftsmanship, clearly expensive, with elaborate initials engraved in the metal. CWM. Gideon frowned. The bag seemed out of place with Clara's simple clothes and quiet manner. He turned away, uncomfortable with his own curiosity, but the question lingered. The following day, with the stock tended and basic repairs made, Gideon rode into town for supplies. The snow had settled enough to make the trip possible, though the going was slow. Main Street was quiet, most folks still waiting out the weather, but the mercantile's pot-bellied stove drew its usual crowd of gossips and idlers. He was checking the price of coffee when he overheard two ranch hands talking by the barrel of dried apples. Railroad widow, they say, one muttered, carrying a fortune in mining shares in that fancy traveling bag of hers. Old man Winslow's been offering a reward for news of her whereabouts. Heard she was heading west, the other replied. Though, in her condition, she can't have gotten far in this weather. Gideon's hand tightened on the coffee tin. The men's words followed him home, echoing with each crunch of his horse's hooves in the snow. That evening, Clara served up a simple but tasty stew she'd made from their dwindling supplies. Sam chattered about the story she'd read to him that afternoon, but Gideon found himself studying her with new eyes across the lamplight. She moved with that same quiet grace, spoke with the same gentle courtesy. But now he noticed other things, the way she held herself, the careful precision of her speech. The kind of manners that came from better schooling than most frontier women received. Her hands were work-worn now, but they hadn't always been. Clara met his gaze once, questioning, and Gideon quickly looked away. The initials on that brass lock nagged at him. CWM. Clara. W.A.T. Morgan? Was Morgan even her real name? He thought of the reward mentioned in town, of the fortune in mining shares. Then he thought of the careful way she'd mended his gloves, the patience she'd shown teaching Sam. Neither image quite fit with a woman running a con, but Gideon had learned the hard way that appearances could deceive. The question was, what kind of deception was he harboring under his roof? The storm broke overnight, leaving behind a pristine world of white under a startling blue sky. Morning sunlight sparkled off the snow like scattered diamonds, and the air held that special crispness that comes only after a winter storm passes. Gideon stood on his porch, breathing in the clean air. The snow had settled enough to make town possible, and their supplies needed replenishing. Sam burst out the door beside him, already wrapped in his winter coat and practically bouncing with excitement. "Can I come to town, please, Uncle Gideon?" Sam's cheeks were pink with anticipation. "I want to tell Mrs. Peterson about Miss Clara's biscuits. They're almost as good as hers." Gideon couldn't help but smile. "Reckon you can, long as you help. Me load the wagon first." They hitched up the team while Clara watched from the kitchen window, her hands busy with breakfast dishes. The morning sun caught her face, and for a moment, Gideon thought he saw something wistful in her expression. The ride to town was slow but steady, their wagon cutting fresh tracks through the snow. Sam filled the quiet with endless chatter about Clara's cooking and the stories she'd been reading to him. "She knows all about mining too," Sam said, kicking his feet against the wagon seat. "She told me how they dig tunnels and use special lamps, so the air don't go bad." Gideon's hands tightened on the reins. More pieces of the puzzle, but he still couldn't see the whole picture. Main Street was coming back to life after the storm. They left the wagon at the Mercantile and headed first to the post office, where Deputy Shaw was sorting through a stack of papers. "Morning, Gideon. Sam." The deputy nodded, then reached for a folded notice. "Say, you wouldn't happen to have a Clara Morgan staying out your way?" Gideon's spine stiffened. "What if I do?" Deputy Shaw held out the paper. "Official summons from Denver. Regarding ownership claims in the Silver Crown mine." He lowered his voice. "Mighty valuable piece of property, that one. Been some talk about it in certain circles." Gideon took the notice, his suspicions confirmed. The name matched exactly what he'd overheard in town. He tucked the paper into his coat, aware of Sam's curious eyes. They finished their errands quickly: flour, coffee, sugar, and a few other necessities. Sam begged for a piece of stick candy, which Gideon allowed. The boy's sweet tooth reminded him of his sister, gone these 4 years now. The ride home was quieter. Sam content with his candy, and Gideon's mind turning over this new information about their guest. The notice felt heavy in his pocket. Clara was in the yard when they returned, spreading corn for the chickens. She'd wrapped herself in one of Gideon's old work coats against the cold, and something about the sight made his chest tighten strangely. "Miss Clara," Sam jumped down before the wagon fully stopped. "We got candy and coffee and—" "Sam," Gideon cut in gently. "Help unload first." He reached into his coat and pulled out the notice. "This came for you." Clara's face went still when she saw the paper. She took it without a word, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the seal. Her eyes moved across the words, and Gideon saw her shoulders slump just a fraction. "I reckon you've got questions," she said finally, looking up at him. "Reckon?" "I do." She folded the notice carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "Money's ruined more folks than winter ever has." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I've seen what greed does to good people. How it twists them up inside until they can't recognize themselves anymore." Before Gideon could respond, hoofbeats sounded from the road. A rider approached at a steady lope, Pete Anderson, one of the smaller ranchers whose spread bordered Gideon's to the east. "Halle," Pete called out, reining up. "Thought you ought to know Mallory's been asking questions about water rights again." His boys were measuring the creek flow where it crosses your property line. Gideon's jaw tightened. Mallory Fitch had been trying to control the spring water that fed several smaller ranches, including Gideon's. Without that water, their cattle wouldn't survive the summer. "He's got no claim to that water," Gideon said. "It's deeded with the land." Pete shook his head. "Man like that, he makes his own claims. Just watch yourself. He's been spreading money around town, buying up support." After Pete rode off, Gideon turned to find Clara staring at the snow-covered peaks in the distance, her expression thoughtful. The notice from Denver crinkled in her pocket as she moved. "Miss Clara?" Sam's voice broke the tension. "Will you tell me another mining story while we put away the supplies?" She smiled down at the boy, but Gideon caught the shadow behind her eyes. Whatever brought her here, whatever wealth she carried in that brass-locked bag, it wasn't a simple matter of greed. He'd seen enough to know that much. The rest of the day passed in quiet industry supplies to store, animals to tend, preparations to make for the cold night ahead. But questions hung in the air between them, as thick as the smoke from the chimney rising against the winter sky. The evening settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that sent everyone seeking the warmth of the fireplace. Sam had already climbed up to his loft bed, leaving Clara and Gideon alone in the flickering FIRIHT. Clara sat in the worn armchair, her hands folded protectively over her rounded middle. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face as she stared into the fire, lost in thought. Gideon added another log, the crack and pop of the wood filling the silence between them. "My father," Clara began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "taught at the Cherokee school in Indian Territory. He believed education could bridge any divide. A small smile touched her lips. My mother was one of his students. They married. Despite all the whispers and sideways looks, Gideon settled into his chair, saying nothing, letting her words flow at their own pace. I grew up with both worlds, my mother's traditions and my father's books. When Thomas, my husband, first courted me, he said that's what drew him to me. Said I had depths, like the minds he worked with. Her voice caught slightly. His family didn't see it that way. The fire popped loudly, making them both start. Clara drew a deep breath before continuing. The Winslows, Thomas's family, they're railroad people. Old money, old ideas. They tolerated our marriage because Thomas threatened to walk away from the family business. Her fingers twisted in her lap. But when he died, everything changed. The mine? Gideon prompted quietly when she fell silent. Thomas left controlling interest to me. He knew his family would try to push me out otherwise. Clara's chin lifted slightly, a flash of steel showing through her gentle demeanor. They didn't expect that. A Cherokee woman owning part of their precious Silver Crown mine. She shifted in her chair, one hand moving to her back where the long day's aches had settled. When they learned about the baby, they ... Her voice trembled. They're trying to declare me unfit. Say the child would be better raised in a proper family. Gideon's hands tightened on his chair arms. He'd seen this story before, wealthy families using their money and influence to remake the world as they saw fit. That's why you're running west, he said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded. They have judges in their pocket, lawyers on retainer. I won't let them take my baby. The firelight caught the tears in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. I won't let them erase who we are. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the moments as they sat in companionable silence. Outside, a coyote called lonely into the night, and somewhere in the distance, another answered. Morning came sharp and clear, the sun doing little to warm the frigid air. Gideon was checking the barn when he heard the commotion, horses snorting, men shouting. He strode out to find 3 of Mallory's riders stringing barbed wire across the path to the spring. This here's private property, Gideon called out, his hand resting near his hip. The lead rider, a weather-beaten man named Tucker, spat into the snow. Mr. Mallory says different. Says the water rights ain't been properly filed. He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Best take it up with the judge if you got complaints. Gideon's jaw clenched. They all knew Mallory had the local judge in his back pocket, just like he had half the county officials eating out of his hand. He was still standing there, calculating his options, when Clara appeared beside him. She'd wrapped herself in her cloak, but her bearing was straight and proud. Mr. Hawley, she said clearly, I believe I might have a solution. She turned to face him fully. The Silver Crown mine supplies coal to all the major cattle operations in the territory, including Mr. Mallory's winter feedlots. Gideon's eyes widened slightly as he understood her meaning. You're suggesting a meeting. Clara's smile held an edge of steel. To discuss mutual interests. I suspect Mr. Mallory might be interested in keeping his coal prices reasonable. Tucker and his men had stopped working, clearly unsettled by this turn in the conversation. Best tell Mr. Mallory, Clara called to them, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air, that Mrs. Morgan from the Silver Crown mine would like to discuss business arrangements. All of them. The riders exchanged glances, then quickly mounted up and rode off, leaving their half-finished fence behind. You didn't have to do that, Gideon said quietly when they were alone. Clara turned to him, her eyes serious. Yes, I did. You've shown me kindness when I needed it most. And I've learned the hard way that sometimes you have to stand your ground. Within the hour, they were preparing to ride out. Gideon saddled his best horse while Clara borrowed his gentlest mare. Sam stood on the porch, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Can't I come too? He called out. Not this time, nephew. Gideon adjusted Clara's stirrup. Need you to keep an eye on things here." The boy's chest puffed up with importance. "Yes, sir." As they mounted up, the morning frost bit at their cheeks. Clara settled into her saddle with practiced ease, despite her condition. She caught Gideon watching and smiled. "My father always said I was more comfortable on horseback than in a parlor," she said. "Drove my mother-in-law to distraction." They rode out together, Sam waving enthusiastically from the porch. The winter sun glinted off the snow, nearly blinding in its brightness. Ahead lay Mallory's ranch, and whatever challenges waited there. But Gideon couldn't help noticing how naturally Clara rode beside him, as if she'd always belonged there. The Mallory ranch spread out before them like a small town, with multiple barns, bunkhouses, and a main house that could have swallowed Gideon's cabin 3 times over. Ranch hands paused in their work to stare as Clara and Gideon rode up to the hitching post. Mallory met them on his broad porch, his silver-streaked hair slicked back, his vest straining against a well-fed belly. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, now, if it ain't Gideon Hawley." Mallory's gaze slid dismissively over Clara. "Bringing company to beg favors?" Gideon's jaw tightened, but Clara spoke first, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Mallory, I'm Clara Morgan of the Silver Crown Mine. I understand you receive regular coal shipments from our operation." The change in Mallory's expression was subtle, but immediate. His eyes narrowed as he studied her more carefully. "The widow Morgan? Heard tell you'd gone missing." "Not missing," Clara replied. "Simply attending to business matters personally." She dismounted carefully, one hand steadying herself against her horse. "Shall we discuss those matters inside? The weather's not favorable for lengthy outdoor conversations." Mallory's lips pressed into a thin line, but he gestured them inside. The parlor was overly warm, decorated with mounted deer heads and expensive furniture that seemed at odds with the rough country outside. "Your fence across Gideon's spring access," Clara began, settling into a chair. "It needs to come down," Mallory barked out a laugh. "That so? And why would I care what some railroad widow thinks about my property rights?" "Because that widow controls your winter coal shipments." Clara's voice remained gentle, but her words carried weight. "It would be unfortunate if delivery prices doubled, or if shipments became unreliable." The room grew very quiet. Mallory's face flushed red. "You threatening me, woman?" "Not at all." Clara smoothed her skirt. "I'm suggesting a mutually beneficial arrangement. The fence comes down, and your coal prices remain reasonable." "And what about his pauper's herd?" Mallory jerked his chin toward Gideon. "Grazing wherever they please, eating my grass." Gideon stepped forward. "My cattle ain't never strayed onto your land, Mallory. You know that's a lie." "Then you won't mind keeping them clear of my property line," Mallory said with a cold smile. "That's my term. The fence comes down if your scraggly beasts stay off my grass." Clara glanced at Gideon, who gave a short nod. "Agreed," she said. "Though I trust you understand this arrangement depends on good faith from all parties." Mallory studied them both for a long moment, then pushed himself up from his chair. "Tucker!" he bellowed. When his foreman appeared, he growled, "Get that fence down from Howell's Spring today." The ride back was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and purple. "You've been running a long while," Gideon said finally, breaking the silence. Clara's shoulders slumped slightly. "Since I learned what the Winslows planned for my baby. Weeks now." She adjusted her cloak against the cold, sleeping in barns when I could find them, station houses when I couldn't. Gideon thought about her that first night, asking only for shelter from the storm. He thought about the careful way she'd handled herself with Mallory, protecting not just her own interests but his as well. "No wonder you cook so well," he said. "Probably glad for a proper kitchen after all that." A small laugh escaped her. "You're Kitchen may be simple, Mr. Hawley, but it's warm. And the company is ... double quotes. She paused, choosing her words. Kinder than I expected to find out here. The sun had set by the time they reached the ranch. Sam burst out of the cabin, practically bouncing with excitement. Did you show him? Did Mr. Mallory get mad? Is the fence coming down? Slow down there, nephew, Gideon said, helping Clara down from her horse. Let's get these animals settled first. Then we can talk over supper. Clara insisted on helping with the cooking, despite Gideon's protests that she should rest. Soon the cabin filled with the smell of cornbread and beans. Sam set the table without being asked, carefully placing their 3 plates just so. Was simple but satisfying. Sam peppered them with questions about the meeting, his eyes wide as Clara described how she'd stood up to the cattle baron. When the plates were clean, Sam helped clear the table, then turned to Clara with hope shining in his eyes. Miss Clara, he said, fidgeting with his shirt sleeve, spring's an awful long way off yet. He glanced at his uncle, then back to Clara. Maybe you could stay till then? Help me with my reading and such? The question hung in the air. Clara's hands stilled on the dish rag she held. She looked at Gideon, uncertainty clear in her expression. Gideon studied the rough wooden table, not meeting either of their gazes. But something in his face had softened, the usual stern set of his mouth relaxed just slightly. Getting dark early. These days, he said finally, ain't safe for anyone to be traveling alone, especially not in winter. Clara's eyes glistened in the lamplight. Thank you, she whispered. Sam whooped with joy, then quickly clapped a hand over his mouth when Gideon raised an eyebrow at him. Sorry, Uncle Gideon. But can I show Miss Clara my new reader before bed? 1 chapter, Gideon said firmly. Then, it's time for sleep. Outside in the gathering dark, fresh snow crunched under steady hoofbeats. Tucker, Mallory's foreman, rode slowly past the ranch, his shape barely visible in the shadows. He studied the warm light spilling from the cabin. Windows, the smoke curling from the chimney, the 2 horses in the barn. Then he turned his mount and disappeared into the night, leaving only tracks in the new fallen snow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground as Clara scattered feed for the chickens. The hens clucked and pecked around her boots, their breath visible in the crisp air. From the barn came the steady rhythm of Gideon's hammer as he worked on fixing a broken wagon wheel. Sam darted back and forth from the woodpile, his arms full of kindling, cheeks red from the cold. Clara paused to rest one hand on her lower back, watching the peaceful scene. The past week had settled into a comfortable routine that almost let her forget why she'd fled west in the first place. The chickens scattered as Sam rushed past with another armload of wood. Miss Clara, he called out. Uncle Gideon says we might get more snow tonight. Should we gather extra eggs for baking? That's good thinking, Clara replied, smiling at his enthusiasm. We could make cornbread if... The sharp sound of hoofbeats interrupted her words. A boy on a lathered horse rode hard toward the ranch, his messenger's bag bouncing against his hip. Clara's heart clenched. Telegraph riders rarely brought good news. Gideon emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Whoa there, son, he called as the boy reined in. What's the rush? Message for Mrs. Clara Morgan, the boy announced, already digging in his bag. From Denver. Marked urgent. Urgent. Clara's fingers trembled as she took the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. She recognized it immediately as the kind the Winslows used for their correspondence. She broke the seal and unfolded the message, her eyes scanning the neat lines of text. The color drained from her face. Clara? Gideon stepped closer, concern etching his features. What is it? They're in Denver, she whispered. Elias and Margaret, my husband's parents. They filed papers with the territorial court. Her voice caught. They're trying to claim custody of my baby before it's even born. Sam moved to her side, pressing close like a worried pup. They can't do that, can they, Uncle Gideon? Gideon took the telegram, reading it carefully. His jaw tightened at the words. Says here they've got witnesses willing to testify you're destitute and unfit. He looked up, anger flashing in his eyes. Bought and paid for, I'd wager. Clara rapped, her arms around herself, trying to still the trembling in her hands. They have money, influence, the right people in their pocket. She drew a shaky breath. And I ran. That won't look good to a judge. You ran to protect your child, Gideon said firmly. Any parent worth their salt would understand that. The telegraph boy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Gideon pulled a coin from his pocket and tossed it up to him. Much obliged for the delivery, son. Best head back before the weather turns. They watched the rider disappear down the road, then Gideon turned to Sam. Finish bringing in that kindling, then see to your studies. When Sam opened his mouth to protest, Gideon added gently, Miss Clara and I need to talk some business. Once Sam was inside, Gideon led Clara to the barn where they could speak privately. The familiar smells of hay and leather surrounded them, and the horses nickered softly in their stalls. We'll fight this, Gideon said, his voice low and determined. I know I ain't got no legal standing, but I won't let them take your child. Clara looked up at him, tears threatening to spill. Why would you help me? You barely know me. I know enough. He met her gaze steadily. I know you're honest and hardworking. I know Sam lights up when you help with his lessons. And I know what it's like to raise a child that others think you've got no right to. He glanced toward the house where Sam was visible through the window. Sometimes family is about more than blood. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I have to face them, she said finally. Running won't solve this, but I can't do it alone. Gideon was quiet for a moment, thinking. The mine workers, he said. You said you kept on the old hands, gave fair wages when your husband died. Kept families fed through the lean times. Yes. Clara nodded slowly. Many have been there for years. Good men who knew my husband, who've seen how I've tried to run things fairly. Then that's where we start. Get them to speak for you. Tell the truth about who you are. Gideon crossed his arms, considering. It's a few days' ride to the mine, even in good weather. Winter travel will be slow, especially in your condition. I know. Clara pressed one hand to her rounded belly. But I have to try. The Winslows. They don't see me as a person, just an embarrassment to their family name. They'd raise my child to be ashamed of their Cherokee heritage, to deny everything my mother taught me about our people's ways. Then we'll leave tomorrow, Gideon said firmly. I'll have Sam stay with the widow Jenkins in town she's looked after him before when I've had to travel. He paused, then added softly, You ain't alone in this fight anymore, Clara. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest despite the winter chill. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness. We'll figure that part out later. Gideon's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. For now, let's get through supper and start planning for the journey. Sam's going to have 1,000 questions once he realizes we're leaving. As if on cue, Sam's voice called from the house, Uncle Gideon. Miss Clara, the fire's getting low. They shared a brief smile before heading back to the house where Sam waited with his reader in hand, eager to show Clara his progress. The telegram lay forgotten on the barn shelf, but its message weighed heavy on both their minds as they moved through the evening routine, each lost in thoughts of the challenging journey ahead. Dawn painted the frozen landscape in shades of pearl and gold as Clara folded her spare dress into her carpet bag. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, arranging the few possessions she'd carried with her since leaving Denver. The morning air bit sharp and clean through the ranch house's thin walls. From the kitchen came the sounds of Sam helping Gideon pack trail provisions, coffee, beans, jerky, and hard biscuits rattling into tin containers. Clara paused at the window, watching her breath fog the glass. The snow-covered pastures stretched white and endless toward the mountains. "Miss Clara?" Sam's voice drew her attention. He stood in the doorway, shifting from foot to foot, something hidden behind his back. "I got something for your trip." She turned, offering him a warm smile. "What's that?" Sam pulled out a shiny red apple, only slightly bruised. "Found it in the root cellar. For luck," he said, extending it toward her. "Uncle Gideon says the trail can be mighty long." Clara's throat tightened as she accepted the gift. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, Sam." She tucked the apple carefully into her saddlebag. "I'll think of you when I eat it." Gideon appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. "Sam, best get your things together. Mrs. Jenkins will be expecting you before noon." As Sam scampered off, Gideon stepped into the room. "There's something else you need to learn before we head out." He held up an old Colt single-action revolver, its blued steel worn but well-maintained. "Ever handled one of these?" Clara shook her head. "My husband didn't approve of women shooting." "Well, out here, it ain't about approval, it's about survival." Gideon checked the cylinder, then led her outside behind the barn where he'd sat. Up some empty cans on a fence rail. The metal was cold in Clara's hands as Gideon showed her how to hold the revolver properly. "Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot," he instructed. "Sight down the barrel, squeeze, don't pull." Clara's first shot went wide, the recoil stronger than she'd expected. But Gideon was patient, adjusting her stance, explaining how to breathe. By the sixth shot, she'd managed to knock one can off the rail. "Good," Gideon nodded approvingly. "We'll practice more when we make camp. For now, keep it in your saddlebag, just in case." The morning stretched toward midday as they finished preparations. Sam hugged Clara tight before climbing into the wagon that would take him to town. "You'll come back, won't you?" he whispered against her shoulder. "Of course we will," Clara assured him, smoothing his unruly hair. "Be good for Mrs. Jenkins." They watched until the wagon disappeared around the bend, then mounted their horses. Clara's mare, rested from the long journey that had brought her to the ranch, pranced beneath her, eager to move. The sun hung pale in a pearl-gray sky as they rode. Out, their horses' hooves crunching through the crusty snow. Gideon led them along a winding trail that skirted the steepest slopes. Picking their way carefully across the winter-locked landscape, they rode mostly in silence, saving their breath in the thin mountain air. Clara found herself studying Gideon's broad back, the sure way he sat his horse, how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. He was nothing like her late husband, who'd preferred railway cars to saddles and ledgers to open sky. By late afternoon, when the light began to fade, Gideon reined in beside a small structure tucked against a stand of pines. "Line shack," he explained. "Used it during spring roundup, before the railroad made it easier to move cattle. Nobody's been here in years, but it'll keep us warm enough." The abandoned shack was crude but solid, with a stone fireplace and wooden bunks built into one wall. While Gideon tended to the horses, Clara swept years of dust from the plank floor with a pine branch. Soon, a small fire crackled in the hearth, driving back the darkness and cold. They shared a simple supper of jerky and beans, letting the warmth seep back into their tired muscles. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Why didn't you ever marry again?" Clara asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. "After raising Sam all these years, surely you must have thought about it?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Thought about it, sure." He shifted, adding another piece of wood to the fire. "But after what happened with that cattle deal, losing near everything we had," he shook his head. "Trust doesn't come easy anymore. Had to focus on keeping Sam fed and the ranch running." Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I understand that. Trust is precious, easily broken. But it can be earned," Gideon said softly, meeting her eyes across the firelight. You're proving that. The simple honesty in his words warmed Clara more than the fire. Outside, the coyote's song rose higher, echoing off the frozen hills under a pearl-white moon. She thought of Sam's apple in her saddlebag, Gideon's patient lessons with the revolver, the way he'd never once questioned her story once she'd told it. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower, each lost in their own thoughts while the night deepened around the little line shack. Tomorrow would bring more miles, more challenges, but for now, this moment of shared trust was enough. The afternoon sun hung low in a steel gray sky as Clara and Gideon crested the final ridge overlooking Silver Crown Mine. Below them, weathered buildings clustered around the mine entrance like fallen leaves around a tree trunk. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, and the distant clang of metal on metal echoed up the slopes. Clara drew her mare to a halt, drinking in the familiar sight. It hasn't changed much, she murmured, adjusting her cloak against the biting wind. Looks well kept, Gideon observed, scanning the orderly rows of bunkhouses and the steady stream of workers moving between buildings. They picked their way down the snow-packed trail, their horses' hooves crunching through patches of ice. As they approached the main yard, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy wool coat strode out to meet them, his red beard frosted with tiny icicles. Saints preserve us. His booming voice carried across the yard. If it ain't Mrs. Morgan herself. Tierney O'Rourke's weathered face split into a wide grin as he reached up to help Clara dismount. We've been worried sick since word came about those vultures circling in Denver. It's good to see you too, Mr. O'Rourke. Clara smiled, accepting his help. Her boots had barely touched the ground when Tierney wrapped her in a brief, respectful hug. You're frozen through, the both of you, he declared, nodding a greeting to Gideon. Come inside where it's warm. The afternoon shift's about to break for supper, perfect timing for what needs saying. They followed Tierney to the mess hall, a long building filled with the scent of coffee and wood smoke. Workers were already filing in, stamping snow from their boots and hanging their coats near the pot-bellied stove. Clara recognized many faces, Cherokee men who'd worked the mines since before her marriage, Irish immigrants who'd arrived during the last railway push, and a handful of German craftsmen who maintained the equipment. Conversations hushed as the miners noticed her presence. Several men touched their caps in greeting, while others offered quiet words of welcome. Tierney guided them to a spot near the front of the room where they could address everyone. Mrs. Morgan's got something important to say, Tierney announced, his voice filling the space. And I reckon we all owe her a proper listening. Clara stepped forward, conscious of every eye upon her. The rough wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she gathered her thoughts. Behind her, she felt Gideon's steady presence, lending her strength. Many of you know me, she began, her clear voice carrying to the rafters. You knew my husband, and you know how I've tried to run things since his passing. She placed one hand protectively over her swollen belly. What you might not know is that his family, the Winslows, are trying to take everything, including my unborn child. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the room. An older Cherokee miner named Joseph spoke up from his seat near the stove. Because of your mother's blood? He asked quietly. Clara nodded. They claim I'm unfit. They've hired men to say I can't manage the mine, that I'm destitute. She straightened her shoulders. But you all know the truth of how things are run here. That we do, came a chorus of voices. Heads nodded around the room. Tierney stepped forward. When Mr. Morgan was alive, we were lucky to see fair pay once a month. Since Mrs. Morgan took charge, we've had regular wages, better timber in the shafts, and a proper doctor on call. He turned to address the room. How many of your children got well because she made sure we had medicine when the fever came through? Hands raised across the room. A German carpenter named Schmidt stood up. My youngest would have died without that medicine, he said firmly. My wife still prays for you, Mrs. Morgan. Clara blinked back tears as more men rose to speak stories of fair treatment, of help during hard times, of respect shown to all regardless of origin. The warmth of their loyalty filled the room like sunlight. What we need, she said when the voices quieted, are witnesses. People willing to write down what they know of my character and the mine's management. Some who might travel to Denver to speak before a judge. You'll have them, Tierney declared. Every man here who can write will put his name to paper tonight. Those who can't will make their mark with witnesses. He looked around the room. Who'll stand up in Denver? Hands rose again, Joseph Schmidt and several others. Clara's heart swelled at their readiness to help. These men who worked so hard, for every dollar, were willing to leave their jobs to speak for her. As the miners began to disperse for supper, Tierney turned to Clara and Gideon. You'll both need proper rest before heading back. Mrs. Morgan, we've kept your old room in the small bunkhouse ready, just in case you ever returned. He nodded to Gideon. And sir, you're welcome to take the spare bed in my quarters. Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to fall as Clara followed Tierney to the bunkhouse. The small room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a pot-bellied stove already warming the space. Through the window, she could see lights coming on across the camp as darkness settled over the mountains. We'll have those statements ready by morning, Tierney promised before leaving her to rest. Sleep well, Mrs. Morgan. You're among friends here. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day's blessing. In the growing darkness, she watched the snow fall more heavily, each flake a silent promise of support from the people who knew her true worth. The storm hit with surprising force that evening, howling around the mining camp's buildings like a hungry wolf. Clara stood at her bunkhouse window, watching white sheets of snow obliterate the paths between buildings. The glass pane rattled in its frame as another gust struck, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. 2 days. That's what Tierney predicted when he knocked on her door early the next morning, bringing hot coffee and biscuits. Storms settled in proper, he said, his beard still flecked with snow from his brief walk across the yard. Best wait it out. Where it's safe, Clara nodded, trying to hide her impatience. Every day delayed was another day for the Winslows to build their case in Denver. Still, she knew better than to argue with mountain weather. She spent that first storm-bound morning in the camp kitchen, working alongside the cook's wife, Sarah. Together they kneaded bread dough and stirred great pots of stew, the familiar work keeping Clara's worried mind occupied. The warmth of the cook stove fought back the chill that crept under doors and through wall cracks. Mighty fine help you are, Sarah commented, watching Clara shape perfect loaves. Most ladies of your standing wouldn't know a rolling pin from a fence post. Clara smiled, dusting flour from her hands. My mother taught me early that honest work builds honest character. She patted her rounded belly. I want to pass that on to this little one. Between kitchen duties, Clara sat at the cook's small desk, writing carefully worded letters to Jonathan Hayes, a Denver attorney she'd known since her husband's death. His integrity had impressed her then, and she trusted him to handle her case with both skill and discretion. The Winslows may have money and influence, she wrote, but we have truth and witnesses. I'm gathering statements from the miners, good men who've known my management of the mine firsthand. Please begin preparing our defense. I should arrive within 2 weeks, weather permitting. Meanwhile, Gideon spent the storm days touring the mine operations with Tierney. The two men trudged through drifts to inspect the main shaft, the sorting house, and the storage buildings. Despite the weather, work continued smoothly underground where the miners were protected from the storm's fury. Never seen such well-maintained equipment, Gideon remarked as they examined the steam engine that powered the lift. Everything's clean, organized. Tierney nodded proudly. Mrs. Morgan's doing. She may be gentle-mannered, but she runs a tight operation. Inspects the books weekly, knows every man by name, and makes sure safety rules are followed proper. By the second evening, the storm's fury began to fade. Clara joined the miners for supper in the mess hall, where Schmidt presented her with a thick envelope. 38 statements, he announced. Every man who could write or make his mark. All sworn before witnesses. Clara held the envelope close, feeling the weight of those precious papers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world transformed into a glittering white landscape. Tierney's men had already cleared the main paths and readied a small wagon for their return journey. They loaded it carefully with supplies, extra blankets, and most importantly, the precious envelope of testimonials. "The passes should be clear by noon," Tierney said as they prepared to leave. "But take it slow and careful. No sense risking a rushed journey now." The miners gathered to bid them farewell, many touching their caps respectfully to Clara. Joseph, the Cherokee elder, stepped forward and pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch on a cord. "Medicine bundle," he explained quietly. "For protection on the road." Clara slipped it around her neck, touched by the gesture. The first 2 days of travel passed slowly but steadily. They followed the wagon tracks of earlier travelers, the snow packed firm enough to bear their weight. Each evening, they found shelter in line shacks or abandoned homesteads, careful to always maintain proper distance and respect. On the third evening, with no shelter in sight, they made camp in a small grove beside a frozen creek. The dying sun painted the ice in shades of pink and gold, while their small fire cast dancing shadows among the trees. They'd found good shelter from the wind behind a natural windbreak of rocks and dents evergreens. Clara sat close to the flames, wrapped in blankets, watching Gideon tend to the horses. He moved with quiet efficiency, checking each animal's legs for strain and making sure they had plenty of feed for the cold night ahead. When he finally settled beside the fire, Clara passed him a tin cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I've been thinking," she said softly, watching the flames dance, "about trust and safety." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "All my life, I've had to be careful. Watch my words, mind my step." Being part Cherokee meant never quite belonging in either world. Gideon listened silently, his presence steady and patient beside her. "Even after I married into the Winslow family, I never felt truly safe. There was always judgment, always watching eyes." She touched the medicine bundle at her throat. "But these past days, traveling with you," she met his gaze across the firelight, "I've never felt safer." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable as a newly unfurled leaf. Gideon's expression remained calm, but something softened in his eyes. "You're a strong woman, Clara Morgan," he said finally. "Stronger than you know. And whatever comes in Denver, you won't face it alone." Clara nodded, too moved to speak for a moment. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear above them, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead in Denver. The creek ice crackled softly in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Clara pulled her blankets closer, knowing that tonight at least, she could rest easy under Gideon's watchful guard. The ranch house came into view just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Clara's heart lifted at the sight of Sam bursting through the front door, his face bright with relief. "We were watching for you," he called out, running to meet them. "There's been strange riders hanging around. Mallory's men, I reckon." Gideon's jaw tightened as he dismounted. "They come close to the house?" "No, sir," Sam replied. "Just riding the fence line, mostly at night. Pastor Miller's been checking on me twice a day." Inside, Clara found the house tidy, but tension lingered in the air. A cream-colored envelope sat prominently on the kitchen table, the Denver postmark clearly visible. She broke the seal with trembling fingers while Gideon built up the fire. "The hearing," she said, scanning the letter. "It's set for 5 days. From now," her voice caught. "The Winslows are pushing to have it moved earlier, claiming urgent concern for the child's welfare." Gideon nodded grimly. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow." He headed to the barn to prepare their best horses for the journey while Clara gathered the miners' statements and legal documents into her leather satchel. The crunch of hooves unfrozen ground drew their attention. Mallory sat astride his black stallion, 2 ranch hands flanking him at a respectful distance. "Mrs. Morgan," he called out, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Might we discuss a business proposition?" Clara stepped onto the porch, Gideon moving to stand beside her. Mallory's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you're facing some difficulties," he said smoothly. "I'm prepared to buy your trouble. Full market value for those mining shares, cash in hand. More than fair, considering the circumstances." Clara lifted her chin. "My child isn't for sale, Mr. Mallory. Neither is my self-respect." His smile vanished. "Court's no place for sentiment, Mrs. Morgan, especially not in Denver." He replaced his hat, turning his horse. "Remember that when you're facing those fancy lawyers." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sam stood on the porch with Mrs. Miller, the pastor's wife, trying to be brave as Clara hugged him goodbye. "Mind your manners," Gideon told him gruffly, though his hand was gentle on Sam's shoulder. "We'll be back soon as we can." They mounted up, the precious documents securing Clara's saddlebags, and pointed their horses toward Denver. Behind them, Sam's small figure grew smaller against the weathered boards of the only home he'd known since his parents died. The journey to Denver tested every ounce of their strength. Bitter wind cut through their warmest coats as they guided their horses across the frozen landscape. Clara's hands, though wrapped in wool gloves, grew numb on the reins. Gideon watched her constantly, noting how she pressed one hand against her lower back when she thought he wasn't looking. Their first night's lodging was a way station inn, where drafts whistled through every crack. The second evening found them at Miller's Creek in a room barely warmer than the stable below. Clara tossed fitfully on the thin mattress until midnight, when she jolted awake with a gasp. "Something's wrong," she whispered, clutching her belly. Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He fumbled to light the lamp, his hands shaking as he saw her doubled over. "I'll fetch the doctor." "No," Clara caught his arm, breathing hard. "Wait. It's passing." She pressed both hands to her rounded stomach. "False pains. My mother told me about these." He stayed beside her bed until dawn, counting the minutes between each wave of discomfort. By morning, the pains had subsided, but fear had left its mark on both of them. They traveled slower that day, stopping often to rest. Denver's outskirts came into view just as the sun set on the third day. Gas lamps flickered to life along the busy streets, casting yellow pools on the muddy snow. The boarding house stood 3 stories tall, its red brick facade a stark contrast to the wooden buildings they'd left behind. Their room was small but clean, with a view of the courthouse's imposing columns across the square. Clara stood at the window, one hand pressed against the cold glass. Below, carriages clattered past and people hurried through the evening chill, wrapped in fine wool coats. "Tomorrow decides everything," she murmured, her breath fogging the window pane. The baby moved beneath her hand, as if sensing her anxiety. "All these months of running, of hiding... It ends in that building." Gideon stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring at her shoulder. The gaslights below cast strange shadows across their faces as they watched night settle over the city that would determine their fate. The courthouse benches creaked under the weight of spectators packed shoulder to shoulder. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Clara sat straight-backed at the defendant's table, her hands folded over her rounded belly. Her attorney, Mr. Harrison, shuffled through papers beside her. Across the aisle, Elias and Margaret Winslow perched like well-dressed vultures next to their silver-haired lawyer. Margaret's lips curved in a thin smile as she dabbed her eyes. With a lace handkerchief, the performance wasn't lost on Clara. "This woman," the Winslow's lawyer declared, gesturing dramatically, "has no fixed address, no means of support. She abandoned civilized society to wander among rough elements." He called forward 3 witnesses: a banker, a society matron, and a private investigator who spun tales of Clara's supposed instability and destitution. The judge, a stern-faced man with wire-rimmed spectacles, made notes as each witness spoke. Clara felt hope slipping away with every damning statement. Even Mr. Harrison's careful cross-examination seemed to make little headway against their practiced testimony. Just as the Winslow's lawyer prepared to make his final argument, the heavy courthouse doors swung wide. Boots thundered on wooden floors as Gideon strode in, followed by Tierney O'Rourke and a dozen miners still wearing their work clothes. Gasps and whispers rippled through the gallery. "Your Honor," Gideon announced, his voice steady and clear, "we have evidence that bears directly on this case." Tierney stepped forward, producing a stack of sworn affidavits. "These men can testify to Mrs. Morgan's character and capability. She ran that mine better than any owner before her, treating every worker with fairness and respect." One by one, the miners spoke. They told of Clara's sound business decisions, her concern for worker safety, her determination to see everyone paid a fair wage. Then Tierney revealed the attempted bribery, how the Winslows had offered gold to anyone willing to speak against her. Margaret Winslow's face turned scarlet. Elias gripped his walking stick until his knuckles went white. More murmurs filled the courtroom as the truth emerged, and the judge's expression grew thunderous as he reviewed the new evidence. Clara's eyes met Gideon's across the crowded room. In that moment, she saw not just an ally, but a man who had risked everything to come to stand beside her. The judge's gavel struck with finality. "This court finds no merit in the petitioner's claims. Mrs. Morgan shall retain full custody and control of both her inheritance and her coming child." Elias Winslow's face darkened like a thundercloud. Margaret clutched her handkerchief, lips trembling as their carefully constructed plan crumbled. They swept from the courthouse without a backward glance, their expensive boots clicking against the wooden floors. Outside, the winter sun sparkled off fresh snow as miners and townsfolk surrounded Clara. Tierney's booming laugh rang out as he shook Gideon's hand. "Justice done proper, wouldn't you say?" Clara worked her way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and congratulations until she reached Gideon's side. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she looked up at him. "You didn't just save my child," she said softly, touching his arm. "You gave me a home to dream of." Gideon ducked his head, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Reckon we should head back before Sam thinks we've forgotten him." They mounted their horses, the crowd's cheers following them down the street. The winter wind still bit sharp, but Clara rode with her head high, free at last to choose her own path. Beside her, Gideon led the way home, their horses' hooves crunching through the snow in perfect rhythm. The spring sunrise painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and purple. Wildflowers dotted the meadows where winter's grip had finally loosened, and the sound of rushing water filled the air as the creek ran strong with melted snow. Clara Morgan stood on the freshly swept porch of the Haller Ranch, cradling her 2-week-old daughter, Sarah. The infant's dark curls peeked out from beneath a soft blanket as she slept peacefully in her mother's arms. Gideon and Sam flanked them, watching as their cattle grazed in the distance. Fat and content on the spring grass the ranch had transformed over the winter months. Clara's investment had cleared the last of Gideon's debts, and fresh paint brightened the barn's weathered boards. The sweet scent of baking bread drifted through the open door, mixing with the crisp mountain air. Inside, a lamp cast its warm glow across the kitchen table, already set for supper. As the sun began its descent behind the peaks, Clara leaned against Gideon's shoulder. "It started as one night," she said softly, her voice full of wonder. "Now, it's a lifetime." Gideon's smile deepened the laugh lines around his eyes as he wrapped an arm around her waist. "And we're just getting started." Sam pushed open the door, and their laughter echoed across the yard as they stepped inside. A family complete at last. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stay. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another quiet story full of the kind of love that lasts.